should get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Today we got ourselves a video that's gonna be jam-packed with information. I'm telling you, we're gonna be covering some tips for throw-ups that are gonna help some newer and intermediate graffiti artists, maybe even some advanced guys, and we're gonna be covering a lot of tips for pieces. Tips that we don't really often cover here on the channel and may never have covered here on the channel. And we're gonna be doing it by checking out the amazing work of Vayne. I'm telling you, man, you guys never disappoint me. Every single time you guys recommend somebody, they're always really dope. So best believe you can find his link, or actually the crew's Instagram, in the description down below. I couldn't find a link directly to him, but if you got any, feel free to let me know. But check it out. Here we go. This is the piece. Tell me this isn't dope. This is sick. Check out how he really leans his V over to the left-hand side here. This lets the A fit nicely with its own left lean that has line uniformity, not only with its own extension and serif over here, but the V's serif right there, as well as the V's body right there. And of course this area here as well. So all of that works great for flow. Positioning your letters in certain ways in order to maximize line uniformity and similarity helps out a ton with flow. But then he gets to the Y, and the Y is a bit of a problem letter. As I'm sure you guys know, the Y sucks. But in the right hands, it can do you a lot of good. And because the Y is also in the center of the name, it's a little bit harder in order to work this bottom portion here. So what he does is he shoots the back of the Y down, and then scrunches the Y right here and shoots it right back down again. It's this bend that allows the Y in order to fit nicely and comfortably between the other letters. But notice how the A is affected by this. Pay attention to that, because the A's leg ends there in order to allow for more room for the Y to shoot down. And the N has letter uniformity with the A because it does essentially the same exact thing, as this part of the A, you could say, is pretty similar to this part of the N. That's a real genius and smooth way in order to make those two letters flow, all because the Y wanted to scrunch underneath the A. So when you're doing your own graffiti, think about how one letter interacts with another, and try to see if you can go ahead and do something like he did here with the A-Y-N. Now this right here might just be my favorite piece of Vayne's. I love this thing. It might be the colors, it might be the more simplistic letters, I don't know what it is. I adore this piece. And I'm not gonna lie to you, my dyslexia kind of screwed me on this one. I stared at this for a good like 3 minutes going, where is the N? Because of my dyslexia, I totally read this as an A. But let me explain why that logically and objectively cannot be an A. And this is actually really important to keep in mind for your own pieces. So check this out. In graffiti, we have a lot of extensions. We got a lot of things going on. And a knowledgeable, really good, advanced graffiti artist like our man Vayne here will pay extra attention to their letter structure versus extensions. Notice how his letter structure maintains a certain width and doesn't really get much thinner than that. And this is consistent throughout the various letters. But then look at the extensions. Suddenly, the extensions take on a little bit of a thinner aesthetic to them. And they range from a size just a little bit thinner than the actual letter structure to much thinner than the actual letter structure. And this remains consistent throughout the entire piece. And as the viewer, we can look at that and we can see that this is impossible to be letter structure. It's just not possible. And that's because he already built a healthy and strong relationship between the letter structure versus extensions. Look back at your old pieces and see if your extensions are about the same width as your letter. While sure that is possible to do, it's easier to differentiate letter structure from extensions when you make a very clear difference between the two. And you're consistent with that difference. Also, check this out. What I really like about this piece here is he builds a bit of a pattern with his letters. Provided that you have enough letters, you can do what he did, where he has a pretty large letter, a much smaller letter, once again a pretty large letter, followed by yet again another smaller letter, and then lastly a pretty large letter. That pattern of large small allows him to balance out a name like this really easily, as the second and the fourth letter aren't really adding much weight to their respective sides. Now if you've been here on the channel for a while, you know that more unorthodox letters tend to carry more weight because, well, they're unorthodox, and as a result people notice them, and visual weight is all about how much you notice something. And it looks like Vayne understands that truth. It looks like Vayne is very conscious that the V, because it's a V, is gonna carry a lot of visual weight, as the same is true for the Y. So what does he do? He really bolsters up the E in order to make sure that it can carry the weight of the entire left side on its own pretty much. I mean, let's just look at this. The letter E by itself is the same size as the V and the A together, but yet the piece still has a sense of balance. And that right there is a mark of a really intelligent and good graffiti artist. Now check out this piece right here. Notice anything right off the top? He's doing the same pattern again. Once again, a really heavy V with a much smaller A, a pretty sizable Y with a much smaller N, with a pretty sizable E. Also, this is really random, but I wanted to point this out. I really like the fact that he transitioned flow. If you remember my flow tutorial, you know what I'm talking about here when I say that this line faces the left-hand side, but the N doesn't quite face that direction. These two lines aren't similar enough in order to actually flow. They need a transitional line in order to bridge that gap. And if you remember my flow tutorial, you know where this is going. But he uses this chip right here and his serifs in order to help transition his line into the other line. So now, these two lines flow. And that sets the precedent for the letter E as well. Because now that he's transitioned the flow from a left lean to a right lean, he can now have the right side of his N also be right leaning while still maintaining flow with a right leaning E. If it wasn't for these serifs as well as the chip, this N and E would have struggled to flow at all. Also, what helps out quite a bit is he's got a lot of line uniformity and similarity right here and throughout all of these lines. Now for the throw up. Seeing this is really what made me a massive fan of him. I mean, you can't say anything when somebody's got a nice, clean, crisp throw up. It's just a work of art. It's a work of beauty. And that's exactly the best way to sum this up. Typically, when I'm speaking to a new graffiti artist and I'm giving them tips for throw ups, I usually tell them to keep very oval and rounded shapes to their actual letter structures. This makes it easier to do the throw up rather than having all of these more hard edges. While you certainly can have hard edges, many more advanced graffiti artists will tell you that tends to cause a lot of problems if you're less experienced. But Vayne here, he's got a nice mixture of both round and hard edges, and it makes them work beautifully. A big part of throw ups is how you flow the letters together. Letter uniformity is crucial to a throw up, and it's one of the things that a lot of new graffiti artists get wrong. They tend to try out a lot of different stylistic choices on their throw ups that they can't work on other letters. So while it might work on one, it doesn't work on the rest, which causes everything else to crumble after that. When we check out Vayne's throw up, he has a lot of different features on a single letter, like V, with its harder edge and serif as well, the pointy bottom, and the rounded sides. With this, he's prepared his other letters perfectly fine in order to have all of these details, or some of these details, to help them flow with one another. We move to the A and we have a very rounded top, which is kind of typical of an A, and we also have these rounded bits, which are a pretty familiar shape to what he's already presented on the V, on both sides. He's also got this same uniform detail across both of these letters, which helps out tremendously. Oftentimes in throw-ups, you don't need a lot in order to make two letters flow together. You just need a resemblance. That's really the important part. The Y is where things get a little bit difficult. He knows that if he wants the whole name to flow, he has to change things up that work best for that individual letter, and then he has to carry it to other similar letters. So he knows that this top of the rounded A is going to work well for the A, but he also knows it's going to work well for the Y and the N, which is going to help all of those things flow. However, he knows he still has to carry this detail elsewhere, so what does he do? He brings it over here to the E. But this means that the Y doesn't really have much to flow with the E just yet, and the A doesn't really have much to flow with the E just yet. So how is he going to tie these letters together? How is he going to tie the whole name together? Very easily. You see, he throws this detail, which is very different, very unique than any of the other letters, and then he begins to swing it down in this arc right here. When he gets to the E, what does he do? He repeats the same exact motion, and he swings it in just the same way, coming to a more pointed bottom, just like the V. But notice, he does the same thing with this part of the N, and the N has that in common with the V. So now, the V, the Y, the N, and the E all flow, and the A, the Y, and the N all flow. And since he's still doing the E, he has half of the bottom of the E in order to complete, and he can take this opportunity in order to make that flow with a different letter. So what does he do? He brings this line up, he makes it nice and rounded, nice and circular, and that way it flows with the bottom of the N and the bottom of the A, making the A, N, E all flow. This repetition of visual elements throughout every single letter in his throw-up creates a throw-up that's an absolutely perfect example of what flow should look like for an advanced throw-up specifically, and how you can use flow in a much more minimalist way if you're a newer graffiti artist. You don't need all these fancy things for newer graffiti artists, right? But that's pretty much it for today's video. Let me know what you guys thought. Want to learn more about graffiti? Check out the best how to do graffiti tutorials right up here, and if you're new here, subscribe to the smartest graffiti community anywhere online. I'll see you next week.